Today we're going to focus on American culture and the conformity of the 1950s. My sincerest apologies, but in order to do this properly, I'm just going to touch very briefly on a lot of these things. I'm going to post a bunch of supplementary resources that help you dive in slash really understand and see some of the stuff that we're talking about. So, to move into conformity of the 1950s, we have to look at the very, very uninspiring election of 1956. In 1956, the United States was much more interested in celebrity sports stars, Marilyn Monroe, horse racing, things like that. We had sort of moved past the whole, uh, moved out of the New Deal age. The Great Depression was pretty much in everyone's rearview mirror at this point. The wars were all over. The Cold War was thawing, and in general, both Democrats and Republicans struggled to find issues to really inspire and motivate American voters. And so 56 was, in a very real way, just an even less exciting rematch of 1952. The only controversial piece was Nixon. Nixon had always, his anti communism thing was somewhat shady, and he was accused of taking illegal campaign contributions. But he managed to turn this whole thing by giving this awesome checkers speech where he said that the only illegal campaign contribution he got was an adorable dog, Checkers. You can go look up this speech. I'll probably post a link to it. And in the end, ended up turning everybody to his side and convincing everyone that Nixon wasn't going to do anything shady, and so everyone was pretty comfortable with him being on the vice presidential ticket. There was some concern because Eisenhower had had some health issues, and so there were some people who were convinced that maybe Nixon shouldn't be vice president because he's a little shady. But Nixon had promised everyone he'll be better, and an even more decisive victory was to come in 56 for Eisenhower than we saw back in 50. The 50s were an age of economic growth for a variety of different reasons. The United States, again, didn't wasn't as devastated by the Second World War as the rest of the world. So just like after the First World War, we're now the economic superpower, sort of pushing everyone else forward. Plus, a variety of different government interventions helped the economy to boom during the 1950s. The GI Bill allowed helped pace soldiers to transition to civilian life. It also allowed low interest loans for houses and allowed a lot of former GIs to go to school, which led to massive economic growth during this time period. The federal government, as we said, insured these sort of low interest loans, which allowed far more people to buy houses. It led to this massive boom in housing construction. The government created the U.S. government was behind the International Monetary Fund, which created this. Basically, the United States became the de facto bankers of the world, and there's still some argument to how much power the U.S. should have over the IMF. The IMF gives loans to developing countries, usually with some sort of stipulation that they improve some facet of their society. And so the United States is going to expand its reach globally during this time period. And at the Bretton Woods conference, the US dollar becomes the global reserve currency to the point where basically everyone else's currency is now backed by the dollar, and the dollar is going to stabilize exchange rates between world currencies to the point where when my father was traveling through Europe as a teenager in the 1960s, he didn't even have to change his money to whatever currency he had. He just brought American dollars, and everyone was happy to accept. It was truly a great time for the United States economically on the world stage. As I mentioned before, part of it was the GI Bill that led to this, and part of it was the federal government you know, um, insuring mortgages. But it led to a massive housing boom because, of course, more people could, on the one hand, afford to purchase houses, but on the other hand, new construction techniques led to the mass production of houses much more cheaply than had happened previously. And so, specifically, the creation of suburbs and the creation of these Levitt towns was sort of behind and pushing the housing boom forward. Levitt town was there were a variety of different Levitt towns, but It was a developer named called Levitt who created these sort of mass-produced houses where you could choose one of a couple different models, and then of course because all the parts and all the components were being mass-produced, these things could be constructed in as short a time as a week. And so the first Levittown was on Long Island in New York, but very quickly there was some in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, a lot of other areas, and a vast majority, or not a, well, actually, yeah, a vast majority of Americans could now afford to buy these houses. Admittedly, they're pretty much the same house. And so you get this sense of like suburban conformity of all of these houses looking sort of the same. But the end result of this is, of course, people move out of urban areas and into these suburbs where you can afford to build these houses. See the massive growth of the suburbs around New York in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the number of people who, and of course, you get this weird divide between urban and rural, where the city center is expanding quickly outward into farmland. And the number of people who owned homes go from, again, before the war, somewhere around 45%, to after the war, about 65%. It should also be noted that Levittown had a series of racial exclusion clauses. African Americans were not allowed to buy homes in these suburbs, and many banks would not loan money to African Americans and would not build in low income areas. So this housing boom was mostly for white people, unfortunately, as the documents sort of showed. We also get the interstate highway system during this time period. This was designed as a civil defense sort of necessity in case we need to move troops, evacuate cities, and stretches of them could be used as airstrips in case of emergency. I'm assuming you're familiar with the interstate highway system. It's a series of federally managed highways combining or connecting the country together, and of course, significantly cut down on the amount of time it takes to travel from, say, you know, just hypothetically Lawrence to Topeka. Whereas rather than taking about 45 to 50 minutes taking us state highways, you could take the interstate and you can get there in as little as 30 minutes. It's very convenient. Television starts to become ubiquitous in the years after World War II. A television, as I assume you're aware, is a series of moving images that is now being uh, broadcast over the air into people's houses. And so television is going to change the way that people consume media, moving from the previous sort of radio based media consumption to now moving pictures. Obviously, television changes American life in a variety of different ways, making it be much more stationary and sedentary to the point where, for a time, and I guess I don't know, it'd be interesting to know if this is still the case, but for a time, the television became sort of the focal point of every American sort of sitting area. With the television placed in sort of a central area, and rather than having the seats arranged in a manner to promote conversation between people, they were arranged in a way to focus everyone on glowing this glowing screen that would give us a variety of different engaging content. As far as television shows during this time period, I'll post links to this, but they basically they embodied the typical American family, this sort of idealized suburban lifestyle. I don't know if you've ever seen episodes of Father Knows Best, but you could probably guess what the theme of the show was and sort of who took central stage in a lot of these sort of television shows. There were, of course, outliers. I Love Lucy featured a female protagonist, and in some ways, Lucille Ball broke out of traditional gender roles, and in some ways, she very much conformed to them. So hopefully, I could post a clip of I Love Lucy that will sort of demonstrate this. But in some ways, it was progressive, and in other ways, very much not so. Also, television catered to young people during this time period. Uh, there were a series of dance shows and music shows that would show this, that would sort of broadcast American culture. And hopefully, I'll be able to post links to some of that as well. American culture being shown through television created a sort of homogenization of American culture and society that we really had never had before. With the radio gave some sort of standard broadcasting of culture, but nowhere near the extent that we got from it. Obviously, advertising is going to become central, as is smoking, which becomes much more ubiquitous in the time after the Second World War. Advertising and branding becomes even more important, of course. And the standardization of restaurants across the country, especially fast food, the spreading of restaurants like McDonald's provides a sort of standardization of American culture that we previously hadn't seen. Whereas you could travel around the country and rather than enjoying the local cuisine, you could now go and get a cheeseburger from McDonald's, regardless of where you're traveling. So you'd never have to taste anything new or different or exciting. The baby boom is another sort of hallmark of the 1950s. People have been putting off having families during both the Great Depression, for what I hope are obvious reasons, and also World War II during World War II for, again, logistic reasons. And so the birth rate skyrocketed, creating the baby boom generation, giving us the now famous, or the, yeah, I mean, they were always famous, but what are now referred to as boomers, which, man, we're going to deal with the boomers as we move through this unit here. So, significant expansion of the US birth rate. These are the people who are in their 60s and 70s and are retiring now, creating a massive strain on our public service system. At the same time that we're facing these amazing times, this housing boom, this burst of this expansion of advertising, this consumer culture and standardization of American life, we're also facing the possibility of absolute destruction and the ending of all American life. The United States tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1953. The Soviet Union tested one shortly thereafter. We began then developing new and more deadly delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and such. And so the end result of all of this is the ability of the United States and the Soviet Union to destroy themselves expanded greatly in the 1950s. In order to combat this threat, I'll post a link to this video, but the US government created an amazing civil defense film called Duck and Cover, which will clearly explain to school children exactly what you do if the atom bomb is likely to strike. Uh, just a spoiler in case you don't want to go watch it. Apparently, you survive the atom bomb by putting your head down under your desk, hiding under desks, because clearly it's going to make us safe from the atom bomb. Obviously, ducking and covering, not a solution to the atom bomb, but for people living with the existential threat of death, like a metaphorical sword of Damocles, well, a literal sword of Damocles hanging over our heads at every moment, this provides some semblance of normalcy and like people, the sense that people have a plan. Also, the fact that life could be snuffed out at any moment leads people to reinvest in religion. The United States becomes more religious, both because we could potentially be destroyed, but also to contrast ourselves with the godless atheists of the Soviet Union. So we adopt "In God We Trust" as our national motto in the 1950s. We shoehorn the phrase "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance, which does not fit cadence wise. You have to pause weirdly. I encourage you to try to say the Pledge of Allegiance and note the fact that when you add "under God," you have to like shoehorn it in. It doesn't fit with the cadence of the rest of it. And church attendance increased substantially. A lot of the rules of art were also broken in the 1950s. And, for those of you who are taking AP art history, hopefully Cindy Brigette is going to do a better job of explaining this because I really don't understand it. Andy Warhol is going to create something called, or is going to be on the cutting edge of what's called pop art, which I guess is using popular images juxtaposed in different colors to criticize the standardization and consumerization of the United States. I don't know. I mean, just looks like soup cans to me. I don't get pop art. More interesting, I think, is and yeah, so pop art. Yeah, it's the Statue of Liberty, I guess, and polka dots. More interesting to me is abstract expressionism. People like Jackson Pollock are exploring just tossing paint on canvas in interesting ways, which gives us sort of images like this, which I can spend much more time looking at. So pause the video and take a moment to explain what you see here if you're so interested, or move on and say abstract expressionism is just throwing paint on a canvas and it's not true art. The role of women is also going to be transformed in the years after World War II, the same way the role of women is transformed in the years after every war. After World War II, though, there was this real sense of we're going to try to recapture this perfect American dream in the post war world. So there was this ideal of the American woman then going back home and raising a family in the suburbs. There was a real sense of like reinforcing gender roles. The man is the king of the castle and he goes off to work and provide, whereas the woman stays home and she raises the children and bakes a nice cake. The image of the 50s housewife, as hopefully you read in the documents, is to some degree a myth. And for some women, they found this incredibly fulfilling and great. The 50s provided a whole bunch of labor saving devices that made housework much easier than ever before, which both allowed women to do more and to some degree change the expectations of American women to force them to do more. And it also freed up their time to, have existential crises and such. The existential crises of American women in the 1950s is most captured by Betty Friedan's feminine Mystique. You read a little bit of it, but it's basically expressing discontent with the limited roles that women faced in the 1950s, and that the basic question of what are we doing here? Is this all of this? Is this all that our life is? And obviously, not all women felt this way, but for a lot of women, they felt stifled by the gender roles that the 50s had put upon them, especially after the experiences of the Great Depression and the interwar years. And so this became sort of the manifesto for a generation of American women who were going to start in the future lectures pushing back against these sort of oppressive gender roles and the 1950s idealized nuclear family.